So how do you like this move to where is it? Ohio?
Yeah, I'm Illinois actually, but yeah.
Illinois. Okay, well, sort of Illinois. Okay, I know nothing about the American map. Once you get to the Midwest, even though my dad took us all across the country in a blue Fraser in the 1950s, I still can't keep these states straight. So Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio.
You're asking the wrong person. I think I'm as geographically retarded as
Oh
they come.
my God! Oh, okay. Well, we'll have to thank God for Google Maps and all that kind of stuff. I was speaking in Louisville,
Yeah,
uh,
Kentucky,
Kentucky.
right?
Yeah, about a month ago, and I had no idea of where Louisville was. And Louisville is on a thing called the Ohio River, which sort of gives you a clue that Kentucky must be somewhere near Ohio. And I had the impression that Indiana and Illinois were somewhere in the neighborhood, but I never got a chance to look at a map. TJ, I got a fucking standing ovation in Louisville, Kentucky, from an audience of 500 people, including 100 high school kids.
Well, that's cool.
Uh, yeah, it was very well. Look, when you're
What
doing whatever the Bloom does, and
what was your speech about?
well, it wasn't a speech. In fact, it was much better than a speech. First of all, this thing was called an Idea Fest, and it was based on the theme. I found this rather surprising when I went to its URL of global brain. And I thought, okay, well, global brain is a common phrase. Yeah, it applies to, it's the title of my second book, but it's the title of Peter Russell's book, and it's sort of out there and about. So this has nothing to do with my book. And I got there and discovered that the entire Idea Fest, this annual event, was about my book, Global Brain. And the opening, the thing that set the whole perceptual tone and the whole emotional tone for the event was me and Lakshmi Singh from NPR, the midday NPR newscaster, whose work I think is just terrific. And she interviewed me. Now, because she was interviewing me, we got to talk about something I never would talk about on my own because it's just plain dumb, stupid, obnoxiously egotistical, and that is my freaking life. So we talked about it, and it involves a lot of overcoming what doesn't look. I mean, it's overcoming big problems, being sick in a bed for 15 years, and having a career in the rock and roll business when you've never listened to rock and roll before, and all kinds of weird stuff like that. And it was I'm very conscious of the fact that people like you and me who want to have an impact on other people have an obligation to give other people an icon, a trellis they can grow on, to give other people our lives in addition to our work, our thinking.
Right.
And it worked that way. It gave that audience such a lift, such incredible inspiration. It was astonishing. And since when you're carrying on in order because you really want to do what other people have done for you, reach out across 400 years, and lift people's lives, well, you know damn well the odds are 10 million to 1 against you achieving that, no matter how hard you work at it. So to see it actually happening in a room with other people and them all getting to their feet and giving you a standing ovation and then forming a line that must have been 80 people long outside waiting for autographs on books or autographs on pieces of paper or autographs on anything and all wanting to ask questions, you get a sudden affirmation that maybe what you're doing will not die with you the way most of us die anonymously, and maybe it will do what you've worked your entire life to achieve and live on and provide some a support for other people when they're growing up, and maybe it will do for other kids what people like Galileo and von Leeuwenhoek and even Plato did for people like you and me. So it was, yeah, and then you go back, of course, within hours to your normal insecurity and the feeling that no matter how hard it will all become anonymous.
Well, yeah,
But
you
at
can't.
least for two,
Can you really function on that high, though? I mean, you know,
no, it lasts 2 or 3 hours, and thank God it only lasts 2 or 3 hours in a sense. I mean, it's not a great thing. You'd love it if it lasted forever, but if it lasted forever, you probably wouldn't work as hard. You need the fucking kick in the pants of insecurity. You need, well, apparently God or evolution give us about a 1/8 dose of satisfaction and 7/8 doses of insecurity and kicks in the pants. And then another 1/8 dose of absolute boredom, where things just become so ordinary. Even if you're dealing with the former president of India, and I had a press conference on Thursday at the National Press Club announcing our National Spice Society column initiative with the former president of India, and the former president of India and I were on the phone last week, and the former president of India sent me an email and said, I'm reading your new book, Lucifer Principle. Well, I don't want to tell him it's my first book, and it's been out for 15 years, but
Yeah.
he's the fucking former president of India, and he's a superstar in Asia, and he's reading my freaking book. I mean, that's unbelievable. And today, when I had to put together some press materials on this press conference, I my past experience is you dive into Google News on any day of the week, and this guy is in between 7 and 27 headline stories. But I wanted to check that. I can't really believe that a guy who bothers to get on the phone with me is in 27 headline stories in Asia a day. So I went to check. I hit Dr. Kalam, Dr. APJ Kalam on Google News. Guess how many stories he was in yesterday when I was checking this?
How many?
100.
Huh. That's pretty good.
So I was, and he's reading my freaking books. I mean, this is ridiculous. But then eventually you stop, and TJ, I've been getting bored as all hell. Here I am doing this thing with India and the United States, and it's a former head of state and all of that stuff. Well, everything that you do becomes ordinary very rapidly. And then you want to climb on to the next level because you need some sort of new challenge. Well, without all of those kicks in the pants from boredom, the kicks in the pants from insecurity, and all the rest, how the hell would we ever achieve anything big enough to raise our little ant-like forms just a tiny bit above the colony so that we provide a guide to a future for generations that aren't born yet?
Yeah, I think an accomplishment high is basically the same way as any other high. I mean, if one dose of heroin just kept you high forever, no one would ever take a second one or go out there scouring the streets looking for another one.
Well, there is a positive, if you do amphetamines, because I tried out all the drugs during the period when we were founding the drug culture back in the early 1960s, and then I abandoned them all, and I did amphetamines twice, and amphetamines get you so high. I mean, you figure out all the problems of the world in the next 6 hours. The problem is you ignore everything else in life, and you probably lose a couple of very profoundly important relationships to you. And then comes the plunge. Then comes the fall off the cliff. And for the next 4 days, you are in a state of depression so profound that it defies all belief. So fortunately, the natural highs that come from achievement, you're right. They're terrific. They're not as high as, I've never done cocaine, but they're not as high as amphetamines. But at least the come down is not as precipitous. At least you don't fall into the dark and nasty pit. At least you just get bored with dealing with former heads of state and want to deal with existing heads of state.
It does bring you low enough to look for the next high, though. So.
Oh, absolutely.
That's all it really needs to do.
Right. And part of this is all perceptual. If you see these things as positives, as kicks in the pants to move up to the next level, then you have a good chance of moving up to the next level. If you see these things as miserable pains, if you see it the way they were seen in the 1950s and 60s, in the age of existentialism, when we were all supposed to look into the pit, the darkness, the void, nonstop, when we were all supposed to keep coffins in our bedrooms so that we contemplate death all night long. When we were told, look, I went to when I went off to NYU after spending my first half of my life in science and wanting to learn how to write, we had this revered literature professor who taught one of the poetry classes. Well, poetry, I am in love with poetry. I'd been writing it since I was 13. I really looked forward to this. And this guy was an asshole. He was one of the most revered assholes in the world of literature. And he told you point blank that a poem only has depth. A poem only has value if it is about contemplating death. That's absurd. That's like taking people with 170 IQ and sculpting off the first 160 and turning them into idiots with a 10 IQ. Back in those days, the perceptual frame was focus only on your insecurities, focus only on your depressions, and then act as if all life is about the darkness of depression, and only by functioning in the darkness of depression nonstop can you be of any depth and value. Well, it killed Camus. He committed suicide, for God's sakes.
I guess he couldn't function there anymore.
Without this perceptual frame, with the perceptual frame we're talking about, which takes all of these pains and turns them into fuel, and turns them into kicks in the pants, and turns them into motivators, Without that, these guys, I don't know, they sort of wound their way under the astroturf. It was terrible to see minds just destroying themselves. You know, back in those days, I have this my AOL name, which I gave myself in 1988 when you gave yourself weird names, is Howell Bloom, and Howl is from Allen Ginsberg's poem, the Anthem of the Beat Generation. And he says, I saw the best minds of my time destroying their lives on rooftops and gutters shooting up heroin. And I took that line in The Genius of the Beast and applied it to the people I used to see at CBS and the other major corporations because they were wasting their brains in incredible ways. But when you think about it, the intellectuals of the 1950s and 1960s mired in their existentialism, mired in a point of view that fixated on being depressed constantly and saw that as depth and basically the way to get girls. I mean, it got Sartre all the girls he ever wanted. I mean, Sartre had more pussy in his life than you and I will ever be able to dream of, all on the basis of focusing on depression and expressing it. But this was one of the greatest wastes of minds of a generation I've ever seen.
Well, no, I mean, if it got him laid, then I guess it had some value.
Well, but it only got one of them laid.
Just that
Now,
one.
he was ugly as all sin.
I can think of a few other people who've gotten laid using that whole.
Well, possibly in a later generation, the next generation down the line, Michel Foucault. I'm sure he got as many pretty boys as he wanted because of his fame on college campuses. And college campuses are apparently a great place to troll for gonads, receptive, interested gonads that will pay attention to you. I mean, the academic world is just amazing. It's hopping from one bed to another, but that's another subject.
You know, when people ask me, like, about you, like, who is Howard and you know, what is he, what does he do, I guess that you would consider yourself a scientist, but I always answer that you're a philosopher. Because I've always thought of you as more of a philosopher than a scientist. You know, a philosopher who uses science, obviously. But it seems to me like you take things apart and you ask questions and you offer a lot of radical new ideas. But as far as I know, and maybe I don't know very far, you don't really, like, you know, test your hypotheses. So
No, I think you're absolutely right. Though I regard myself as a scientist because my roots are in science, and I feel I have spent most of my life in science. The fact is that I don't test my hypotheses in a scientific manner. And if what I'm doing is a science, then it's closest to the participant observer science of the social sciences, especially anthropology. An anthropologist goes into a tribe and he tries to experience what that tribe is firsthand. Margaret Mead used to wangle herself into positions of being regarded as, for all practical purposes, a female chieftain. And I've done the same with the rock and roll business, but you know, I did not analyze the kinship patterns in the rock and roll business. There was no formal structure to what I was doing there. It was more like Livingston exploring Africa than it was like somebody like my friend Robin Fox going into the southwestern American Indian tribes and mapping out their patterns of matrilineal, matrilocal, patrilineal, all of that. So even though my whole base, my whole soul is rooted in science, the fact is that philosopher might be a more accurate term.
I'm surprised to hear you say that. I thought you would take more umbrage to that label.
No, we're using other people's labels. You know, I've done what I felt I had to do in order to work out the truths that I've wanted to pursue. And it has taken me way off the beaten track of normal science. When I was still sick and stuck in bed, there was some very rich guy in New York City. It was the 1990s. Sigmund Freud had been dethroned probably sometime in the 1970s or 1980s. Instead of being respected, he was almost cursed. And this very rich person decided to resurrect Sigmund Freud to give him his credibility back. And to do it, he put a lot of money into bringing some of the most amazing scientists literally in the world to New York City the first Thursday of every single month. And some of these guys used to come to New York, spend their time at whatever he was doing, and then, as weird as this sounds, they would come up, make pilgrimages to see this guy in a bed in Brooklyn, me. And one of them, Jaak Panksepp, who is, I think, the most brilliant researcher on human emotions and humor in rats, for God's sakes, tickling in rats, all kinds of really human things that go beyond the bounds of most scientists, sat at the foot of my bed one day and he said, Howard, you are not a scientist until you work out a way to test your hypotheses in the laboratory. And TJ, there was a certain validity to that, and yet there wasn't. And there wasn't in the following sense. He assumed that only what you can see through the limited tool of the laboratory is science. But science is the truth at any price, including the price of your life. Science is looking at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before and then proceeding from there. Science is looking at the real world. The laboratory is like a magnifying loupe. Yes, it is a useful tool, but a very, very limited tool. And somebody's got to step out of the laboratory and see the big picture. And eventually, what I figured out is Jaak was wrong. I have to be able to say to Jaak, your laboratory science doesn't mean a thing until you are able to step out of the lab and see how it applies in the real world. And until you are able to use it to see things in the real world that are outside the walls and the limitations of your laboratory. Science needs to expand into other areas, so I'm in an area between science, as it's conventionally conceived, and where science needs to go by looking at things it has no mechanisms or techniques for understanding right now. Does that make any sense?
Not only does it make sense, I think it's one of my favorite things you've ever said. Um, but I guess that there's nothing more to say on that topic. So, okay, now I know that you and I are going to be a little divergent on this issue. Maybe you won't be when you actually hear my reasoning here, but I don't know. We'll just see in a moment. Because I'm pretty much divergent with everyone that I can think of. Because I don't believe in morality, at least not in the conventional sense, and I guess let me briefly tell you why. First off, I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that all behaviors are equally desirable or anything like that. I'm just saying that our mode of determining the values of behaviors is obsolescent and ineffectual. We get into this system of perpetual dichotomies where everything has to fit into right or wrong, or sometimes we're a little more nuanced and we see it as kind of a gradient where one side is wrong and the other side is right, and then you have these shades of gray, these moral ambiguities, I guess. The reality is, I think, that the desirability of an action is always going to be contingent upon your perspective. I mean, if you're a Nazi, then genocide and conquest and imperialism help you towards your end goal of racial purity and global dominance. So, of course, those things will be morally acceptable to you. So the Nazis really didn't lack morality. They just had a morality that allowed them to do things that we, as the victims of their behaviors, see as something undesirable. So, I'm talking about moral relativism here, and it causes all sorts of terrible problems, obviously. When you have societies that are morally incongruent, you're going to have all these problems cropping up. But the solution that people tend to offer for that is this idea of objective morality. But all societies already have objective morality because all societies view their morality as objective. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think the problem isn't going to go away as long as we have this conventional view of right and wrong. I think that empathy is going to be important in solving the problem, and I also think that getting humanity to view itself as a human collective rather than competing tribes is going to help a long way. I think that can be done, because if
Well,
tribes can become cities, and cities can become states, and states can become united, then we can band together as, I don't know, the united people of Earth. Sorry if I went a bit long there, Howard. What are
no,
your
no,
thoughts?
no. I agree with everything that you've said. Agree with absolutely everything you just said. In fact, once you brought up the fact that we might discuss morality tonight, I was thinking along exactly the same lines, including the same lines about the Nazi. If you were a Nazi in 1939, and you believed that all of the Earth's evils were caused by Jews, and if you believed that the Jews controlled all the banks and all the press, and if you believed that the Jews deliberately caused all the world wars in history in order to achieve their own goals, and all of that stuff was in a book, for God's sakes. Even though the book was totally fraudulent, you didn't know that.
Hmm.
It was in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You didn't know that book was phony. Plus, you hadn't done the arithmetic. There are very few Jews on this planet. It's a handful, and they couldn't possibly pull all that off. But you didn't have access to that information, and you wanted to make the world a better place. How was the world going to become a better place? Well, first of all, the master race was going to have to take over things because all other people were Untermenschen. If you leave a farm in the hands of the pigs, you have Animal Farm. The humans who have a sense of morality and ethics and the betterment of life itself, well, they obviously have to take over. So you're right. To a Nazi, everything that he was doing was not only moral, it was idealistic.
Yeah.
But to people like me, who lost my entire European family, I no longer have a European family, to the Holocaust, it wasn't very nice. And you're absolutely right that each group it does have a sense of morality, and that each sense of morality, this is all in the Lucifer Principle, it's in my first book, that sense of morality relates to just us. What the Lucifer Principle quotes is Margaret Mead saying that every tribe has a rule: you do not kill your fellow human beings. Sounds pretty decisive, right? The problem is that every tribe's name means human beings. So anybody who's not a member of the tribe is not human. That means somebody who's not from the tribe comes along, you have every right to clunk him on the head and take everything that he's got. And what Margaret Mead pointed out is that over the course of time, by the time she was around, there were 200 million Americans.
Hmm.
Well, over the course of time, it had gotten to the point where thou shalt not kill thy fellow human being, instead of applying to between 50 and 150 people, applied to 200 million people. And Margaret Mead felt that was the reason that violence was decreasing. Well, you could look at the world and say violence is decreasing. Are you kidding? We had World War I, we had World War II, we had Desert Storm, we've had war after war after war. But if you do the statistics, the violence is decreasing. Again, back to the Lucifer Principle, it quotes two anthropologists who did a study of primitive tribes, or these days we call them indigenous peoples, and we tend to romanticize them. And it calculated the rate of violence, of violent death among young men in indigenous cultures. And because indigenous cultures make war an awful lot, even Eskimo culture, which we think of as the ultimate peaceful culture, was based on an awful lot of war until colonialism came along, until imperialism came along and stopped the warrior aspect. Well, the result is that the percentage of young men who died in war and violent conflict was huge. It was so huge that if we lost the same percentage of young men in the world today, the modern world, we'd be losing hundreds of millions of young men every year, and in every cohort, in every generation, we would be losing close to 1 billion young men. That's ghastly, and we're losing such a small fraction of that, it's ridiculous. If you look at the progression of wars, in World War I, in the Battle of the Somme, in 4 days, 200,000 people were killed. 200,000 military men, and that just includes the English. 200,000 English, and we have no idea. I mean, we could go and do the arithmetic, it would horrify us, but a lot more than that were killed if you include the Germans and the French. That's in 4 frigging days, for God's sakes. Right now, we are extremely upset in the United States because we've gone over the 4,000 mark in the number of military people we've lost in Iraq. Well, 4,000, snuff one life out, and you have snuffed out an infinity.
Yeah.
You snuffed out an infinity of experience that will never, ever return, no matter what you do. We do not know how to make new lives or how to resurrect them. So one life down is more than we should be able to tolerate. But the fact is that 4,000 is so much less in an 8-year war than the 4 days of the Battle of the Somme that it's absolutely absurd. And then you could say, yeah, but what about all those civilians that have been killed? It's over 100,000 somewhere. That is absolutely true, and it's horrific. I you've heard me say this before, I get extremely upset every time I think of our jackbooted guys pounding their way through the doors of people who are not making war, they're trying to make a living, and ransack their homes and then don't replace the doors and don't undo the damage. If that happened to you and me on a fairly regular basis, we would be rather upset and would probably join the insurgency. Nonetheless, the percentage of violence has decreased dramatically. Now, in the 1980s, when video games came on the scene and they were violent, parents were horrified. Parents said, "Oh my God, these violent video games are going to turn our kids into little monsters." Well, in the 1980s, our major cities, including New York, Detroit, and quite a few others, had real heavy-duty problems with violent crime, with muggings, rapes, all kinds of things. Do you know what the impact has been since Grand Theft Auto came out and was decried as absolutely the most loathsome, violent game on the planet? We don't have the rate of violent crime in cities like New York and Detroit has gone down dramatically since the 1980s. Could video games have anything to do with that? Well, maybe, maybe not. We don't know. We can't do a scientific study. We can't take an identical Earth and set it up someplace else.
Yeah, and there's no video games allowed on this Earth, so let's see what impact it has.
Exactly, and do controlled experiments. So we don't know. But in the same way that...
I always thought that people were right when they said video games stopped violence, but not for the reasons that they thought. I always... people always say, "Oh, well, that gives people they get to exercise their demons through the video game."
Oh, yes, and it says that in The Genius of the Beast. It says we get to exercise the animals in our brain.
Yeah.
What's your explanation? I'm curious.
My explanation is that people are too busy playing video games to bother to commit crimes.
And you know something? It could be totally accurate.
Yeah, we'll never know.
Because it's so much more satisfying to actually splat the enemy and watch him explode with blood and gore all over the place. And you can get so many more enemies down than if you have to go out and hunt in the streets for prey, for real human beings.
Yeah,
and I would imagine it's immensely more satisfying.
Yeah, well, it's you can be as badass as you want, and you can do it in a consequence-free environment, so...
Yeah, exactly. It's just you can't pay for your drugs with whatever you get from winning the video games.
True, but the video games are your drugs, so...
That's true. You don't need crack cocaine because you're servicing the dopamine centers and the endorphin centers in the brain.
Yeah, you're getting high on... You're getting high on violence, basically.
Now, this all sounds ridiculous, right?
It doesn't sound ridiculous to me.
No, it doesn't sound ridiculous to me either. Okay, so
maybe to some hypothetical third party. But
right. Well, so morality is relative to the group that you live in, and you've heard this from me too. One of the things that we fail to recognize in the West, now that we have mounted this religion of human rights, is it is a local thing. It is unique to our culture. It is unique to our culture as making sure that women have veils on their faces is to a great many Islamic subcultures. And when we think it is universal, and hence everybody agrees with us, we are nuts. We don't recognize the profound difference between cultures. And the difference between cultures is extraordinary, really extraordinary. So in the same way that it looks terrible for us, look, gay bashing used to be a common thing when I was a teenager. When I first found out about it, I was horrified that such a thing could exist. But there was a juvenile delinquent. In those days, we had people called juvenile delinquents. And there was a juvenile delinquent who had adopted me. And when he told me about jumping into a car with friends and looking for somebody gay to bash, I was horrified. Well, today, all of us are horrified at that kind of thing. And it tends not to happen anymore. But it's hard for us to realize that in many cultures that we coexist with on the planet today, people are as horrified by gays as you and I are horrified by the idea of beating somebody up. And as a consequence for them, beating somebody up who's gay is a natural thing. And they've grown up that way, and they think that's right, and they feel in their bones that that's right. There is an irony to the first rule of science. The first rule of science is the truth at any price, including the price of your life. Well, what the hell is the truth? My truth is going to be very different from Osama bin Laden's truth, and he's going to feel just as passionate about his truth as I am passionate about mine. And he's going to be just as idealistic about his truth as I am about mine. Which truth is really true? We don't know. We don't have a clue. We just have to go with whatever we feel is the truth. But that's a matter of imprinting. It's a matter of what we imprinted on when we were kids. We talked about the necessity of becoming an icon and giving your life to your audience, so you give them a trellis on which to grow. It's a matter of the trellis on which we grew. And they grew on a different trellis than we did. Which trellis is right? We don't know. Except one thing I can tell you, I really seriously believe that this religion of ours, this very quirky little religion of human rights, I think it's a very important one. And I think that it is worth pursuing in other societies. But I think we have to be realistic when we're performing cultural imperialism. Yes, I would like to see cultural. I did an interview for 3 hours just a little while ago because TJ, I wanted to try it as a warm up, getting my blood going for our interview. And the guy that I was talking to, Len Lamphere, is very concerned with how in the world we get all these miserable women who are being kept as house prisoners, prisoners in their own homes
Hmm.
in the Islamic world, and how we liberate them. Well, we have to liberate them very carefully because there are a whole bunch of guys who know with all of the passion in their heart that keeping their women locked up at home and undercover all of the time and away from meeting anybody but their male relatives, any other males but their relatives, that is the right thing to do. That's the godly thing to do. So we're up against a tricky problem here. These people, of course they believe, because imprinting is really tough stuff. Those things you glom onto when you're 3 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old, and 15 years old, your brain literally wraps itself around them and changes its morphology, its shape, in order to fit those things in as permanences. And that's what a truth is. Something your
Uh,
brain has wrapped its around its tissue around as a permanence.
okay, I want to ask you. Yeah, you were talking just a moment ago about you when you were, younger. You saw the whole gay bashing thing, and it's a lot more socially acceptable then than it is now. Um, you know, I mean, I saw it to an extent when I was growing up too, and that was only 10 or 15 years ago. I was in the school system, so, but I mean, it wasn't anywhere near the extent it was in the 50s and 60s. And obviously, when you were born, there was still segregation in the South. I don't know about the North, but
Oh, there was
anyway,
segregation in the South, and when my dad used to pop us into the Blue Fraser and take us down to Florida, and for the first time in my life, I saw signs on the restaurant windows saying "No dogs or niggers allowed." I was horrified, and then of course we were rejected from several hotels because we were Jewish, so that was going on too. Okay, back
right.
to you, TJ.
Uh, I just want to know. I mean, society has obviously shifted hugely on these issues just in your lifetime. So, I mean, it seems to me like there is definitely a mechanism for de-radicalizing human beings and making them more accepting of people who are different. But and it seems to work pretty quickly, but I don't know what that mechanism is. Do you have any idea?
Um, yeah, I do. You remember the song from the First World War? You remember it well. I remember you marching off as a doughboy, TJ.
Yes, of course.
Um, yes. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Um, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? How are you going to keep them out in isolation, just slopping pigs and milking cows, after they've seen a city of 1.5 million people who are doing their utmost to display in the most flamboyant and flagrant way possible, with little things like the Eiffel Tower and electric lights and all of that kind of stuff? Humans are attracted to other humans. And because humans are attracted to other humans, we keep growing in the size of our societies. And the more we grow in a society, the more capable the society becomes. The more it has room for outriders like you and me. The more it has time for full-time thinkers, philosophers, and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. Inventors, research and developers, poets, actors, all kinds of weird shit. And people just cannot they can't most of them cannot get away from the allure of being among a whole bunch of other people. I have probably told you this story before. I believe it was in either the Lucifer Principle or in Global Brain, my second book. But in the 1960s, from the 1930s to the 1960s, there was a school of architects called the Bauhaus Architects. And these guys were all bloody Marxists, for God's sakes. And as bloody Marxists, meaning upper middle class people who identified with the proletariat, they wanted to create housing for the proletariat. So they created these structures that were so mean, stingy, bare, brutal, that it was ridiculous. And they thought, oh, this is wonderful housing for the proletariat. Oh, my God. Well, they couldn't sell it to the proletariat. The proletariat wanted to have nothing to do with it. So guess who they sold it to, these Marxists? First of all, an awful lot of them were eventually thrown out of Germany because of Hitler. And they came to the United States. And guess who they found as people who wanted these mean, ugly, brutal buildings?
No idea.
Super rich people in the United States.
Uh,
So the Bauhaus architects made these buildings for super rich people in the United States, including most of the office buildings, like Black Rock on 6th Avenue, otherwise known as Avenue of the Americas in New York. So you've got these super sterile buildings. They're wonders, but they're super sterile. Now, these guys assumed that what humans really love is moments of quiet contemplation, to think about their lives and ponder. So they built little mini parks, enclosed mini parks that deliberately gave you isolation from other human beings so you could sit there and ponder. Guess what happened to these buildings when people actually started to use them? Do you think anybody used these little parks that were built for isolation and contemplation? Not a soul. Nobody wanted to go there. Who wants to be where there aren't other human beings? Meanwhile, they had designed these huge areas of steps in front of and around the buildings. But they weren't designed for humans. They were steps. They were things to step on, to put your feet on, not to put your ass on. That's where people went. At lunchtime, when they were let out of their offices, they sat on those steps, they bought food from vendors in the streets, and they sat there and they watched. And guess what they wanted to watch? Other human beings. They were watching the crowds in the street. The crowds in the street fascinated them. And it's that instinct, glom together, keep coming together in bigger and bigger units, that is building human societies. And really, it's not so strange. Even E.O. Wilson, the father of sociobiology, assumed that all species start out as individuals, and they have to go through some sort of incredible change to become social. He's fucking wrong. Hasn't E.O. Wilson, one of the smartest men on the planet, one of the men I most admire, one of the men who's given me more intellectual tools than anybody else I can think of, hasn't he noticed that a bacterial societies are our grandmothers, our great-great-great-grandmothers, hasn't he noticed that those societies have 7 trillion individuals? More than all the humans who've ever lived, and they all live in a big group. And that's the way it goes. There's no such thing as an individual bacterium. I've probably told you this story too. When I was busy concocting one of my books, busy doing the research for one of my books, I had written a sentence about the fact that no bacterium is an island, playing off of John Donne and No Man is an Island.
right.
And I wrote that a bacteria on its own will die. Well, I have 2 people that I call on for bacterial information. One is a colleague, Eshel Ben Jacob, the former head of the physics department at the University of Tel Aviv, whose work on bacterial behavior has made it on the cover of has been the entire cover of Scientific American. And Eshel wasn't available, so I called the other guy that I call on for this stuff, James Shapiro. These 2 are the guys who came up with the realization that bacteria in large groups actually pool so much information about the problems in their environment that they literally reinvent their own genome in order to solve problems. Pretty amazing realization. Okay, so I called James Shapiro and I said, James, I have just written a sentence that says no bacterium is an island. Well, he agreed to that. And if you put a bacterium in isolation, it will die. And he said, oh, no. That's not what will happen to a bacterium if you put it on its own. If you put it in a petri dish where it has any kind of nutrition whatsoever, it will rapidly multiply until it forms a crowd, a colony. Those are not his exact words, crowd and colony, but that's what he was explaining. In other words, bacteria do not live on their own. The default state for living things is not loneliness. It's not being alone in a little pocket garden and contemplating. It is the very opposite. It is creating more individuals if that's what it takes to get a crowd. And then it's crowds competing with each other for which crowd is the most exciting and which crowd is the biggest. We've probably talked about that in beehives, how that crowd thing works. When 5 explorer bees come back with their findings and a bunch of unemployed bees are really bored, not just bored with life, they've lost all interest in life, for God's sakes, and they are desperate for something to excite them. And they start gathering around the bees that are dancing their asses off, the explorer bees who found new sources of food. And the crowd thing works. Gradually, the crowd that becomes the biggest, and the crowd that gets and the dancer gets the most backup dancers wins, and everybody goes off to her discovery. And then the depressed, unemployed bees are no longer depressed and unemployed because they have something new to do, and they can bring back pollen, and they get mobbed by unloaders when they come back to the dock of the hive, the unloading dock of the hive, and they're treated like superstars. All of this is crowd behavior. Now, you could say with bacteria and with bees, but these, bees all come from the same queen. So they all share the same genomes. Yeah, they have 7 different fathers because the queen goes out during her mating phase and she's courted by literally hundreds of males and she copulates with at least 7 of them. And she carries the sperm of 7 of them for the rest of her life. So yes, you could be born, TJ, as a female ant in an ant colony, and I can be born as another female ant. And oh my God, this involves a sex change operation. But at any rate, and your father might be different from mine because we come from the same mother, but she's carrying around the sperm of 7 different males. But our mother is the same. So if our mother's the same, then we're all protecting the same genome, more or less. So you could say that's why we cooperate, that's why we work in a big group, and that's what E.O. Wilson said. And that's why bacteria cooperate. But humans are different. We have different genes. We have much more genetic variation. And our selfish genes push us not so much to be together, but to be apart. That's crazy. Our ancestors were bacteria. Our ancestors did hang around in groups of 7 trillion. The individualism that we think is natural to us, that's not our default mode. The default mode is, hey, get social. How are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen Paris? That's what brings us together. And the bigger our groups get, the more we feel, the larger the number of people is we feel we can't kill, and the larger the number of people is to whom our morality applies.
Because I know you were talking about the tribes can always go to war with other tribes, and then if you look at the Greek city-states, they had no qualms about going to war with one another. But when they became united, you obviously don't war with another. It happens, civil wars and all.
Well, the invention of the state played a major role in this because you're right. The Greeks, there were 500 Greek city-states approximately, and they didn't mind flattening each other. When Pericles, the head of Athens, we've probably done this story before, but okay, so the Greeks are busy warring with each other, and then another bigger superorganism, the Persians, attacks them. And the Persians have an army, if Herodotus is right, of 1 million men that drunk every river dry when they passed it. Herodotus was probably exaggerating. It was probably 100,000. But one way or the other, up against these little puny Greek city-states, the odds of the Greeks surviving in a war of this kind were ridiculously small. But the Greeks got together, and the Athenians led the sea battles, and the Spartans led the land battles. And guess what? They defeated the Persians, even though they were pipsqueaks compared to the Persians. They were nothing compared to the Persian Empire. Well, once they won, the Athenians had all the publicists. The Athenians had all the poets. The Athenians had all the philosophers, because the Spartans were a warrior culture, and they didn't believe in having poets and philosophers and people who just sit around and think and people who just sit around and write songs. The result was that the Athenians out-propagandized the Spartans. And even though you could argue that it was the Spartans who had really won the war against the Persians, the people who took the credit for it were the Athenians. Now, having taken the credit for it, they got the whole bunch of other Greek city-states together into a thing called the Delian League. And the Delian League was a defense league in case the Persians ever attacked again. And the deal was, you pay me tribute every year. I keep it in my treasury for the day the Persians attack. So if the Persians ever attack, I can take that defense money out of the kitty, and we can all arm ourselves real fast and beat the Persians. Okay,
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Sound like a reasonable deal? Okay, the problem is I'm Pericles, and you're another town, another Greek city. And I start taking the money and stealing it and using it to build, I know I've told you the story before. I got this girlfriend. See, I got a wife. And wives in Greece are considered donkeys, so we don't even talk about them. So Pericles' wife never even shows up in the literature. She's a beast of burden, that's all. But Pericles has a girlfriend. He has a mistress. And his mistress invents something new, the salon. The intellectual and artistic salon. And she has oh, she has Socrates in it, and she has Myron, the sculptor, in it, and she has all the guys who wrote all the Greek tragedies, Aeschylus and Thucydides. I'm not probably Thucydides. She has all these great Greek guys in her group. And a couple of them come up with this idea. Why don't we build a temple that's about 10 times the size of any temple anybody has ever seen before? Well, how are we going to pull this off? Well, what about using all that money you've got from the Delian League, Pericles? Sounds good to Pericles. So Pericles takes all the money that was supposed to go only to defense, and he puts it into building the Parthenon. Well, some of the city-states are a little pissed off that their money has been taken to build this mega temple in Athens, and it's supposed to be defense money. So one of these nations, one of these city-states, complains. Well, that's it. Pericles doesn't want to hear any more complaints. If he lets this little pipsqueak city-state get away with complaining, the other 90 city-states might complain. So do you know what he does? He sends off his navy, and they flatten the city, and they kill all the men, and they take all the women and children as slaves. So in the days of city-states, there was still room for a lot of violence between the individual units of the society. And that was also true back in the days, much earlier, in the days of Mesopotamia, in the days of the Sumerian civilization. That was 2,500 years before the Greeks. There were 21 city-states. And periodically, one city-state would whomp all the others and take over all the marbles, like Babylon, for example. But that stopped when we invented something new called the state. Not the city-state, the state, otherwise known as the nation. Because the nation could include a whole lot of cities, it could include a whole lot of farmland, and in the nation, you weren't allowed to clobber each other. Clobbering each other was called a civil war and was considered a major breach, a big distortion in the normal way of doing things, which means the normal way of doing things suddenly became, hey, you guys, I don't want Cleveland fighting Pittsburgh. You got that? I don't want New York clobbering San Francisco. Okay? It's not right to kill all the men in San Francisco and take all the women as sex slaves. You got that? That's the new rule. We call it a nation state. You ready for it? That's the way it goes. So the invention of the nation state helps tremendously in the decrease of violence. Now, by the way, this entire subject is going to be the subject of Steven Pinker's new book, which could come out any minute because the last time he and I communicated about it was a year ago or a year and a half ago. So Steven Pinker is about to take credit for all of this stuff that actually was originated by Margaret Mead and was developed in the Lucifer Principle, which came out in 1995. So I want everybody to remember, we got to it first, gang.
I'm sure
not Steven Pinker.
I'm sure he'll offer some of his own insights. I did want to, since you were talking about Athens earlier, it actually reminded me of something. And
you want me to get off my Athens, right?
No. This is
no. That was a pun. I'm sorry.
I know.
Yes,
I know.
Go ahead.
It was all right. I'm sure you know this story, but I'm just going to let the audience know, and I probably won't do it the same justice that you probably could. But there was an Athenian politician, I guess around 480, 490 BC, something like that, called Themistocles, who was really, really worried about Persia.
Right.
And at the time, there was this big silver discovery in Athens, and Themistocles' rival in the Senate wanted to basically dispense it to the citizens of Athens, and Themistocles wanted to use it to build ships to defend Greece from another Persian invasion. There had been one, I guess, 10 or 20 years before that. But most Athenians at the time, they weren't really too concerned about Persia. They didn't consider it to be a big threat. So basically, he lied to them. He told them that he wanted to build a fleet to defend against some other nation. I don't remember who they were. And that must have seemed like a really good idea to the Athenians, because the opposing politician's viewpoint, even though it would seem to have benefited them more, getting a little bit of money in your pocket. They didn't want that. They wanted to defend themselves against this other nation, which probably retrospectively wasn't anywhere near the threat Persia was, but it was in the eyes of the people. So this guy basically talked everyone out of getting their portion of silver by inflating the threat of this secondary enemy, who I really wish I remember the name of. But he was right about Persia. So basically his lie, or misdirection, if you want to use a milder term, was actually a pretty sound decision. And I know that you have this thing you say called the truth at any price, including the price of your life. So I was wondering, what about a price that's higher? What about the price of your culture or the price of your way of life? Was Themistocles right to lie to the people, basically?
This is a really, really good question because if I were in Themistocles' position, I would have a very hard time lying. I find that you are most at your most persuasive when you have put your whole life on the line, when everything from your kneecaps to your elbows to your larynx has been involved with figuring out some basic truth. And when you can speak that basic truth with all your heart, all your soul, and all your body, that's when when you are at your most persuasive. And it takes enormous amounts of persuasion to get people to do things that they must do, and to get them to see that they must do it. So I would personally have a difficult time doing what Themistocles did. But the ultimate truth is to save as many human lives and to elevate and upgrade as many human lives as you possibly can. And sometimes, if it's a matter of saving lives or saving an entire civilization, I can see there's a value to what Themistocles did, even though I could not personally do it. When you brought up morality, here's the big question
Yeah.
that you immediately fixed my mind on, and I started researching it a little bit tonight. Um, and there's already tons of it in my research notes, but I like to do new research all the time. But it's the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, surely the use of a weapon that awful and the destruction of approximately 160,000 lives. Surely that is utterly, utterly deplorable and cannot be justified under any conditions, right?
Well, I would say so, but
Okay, well, there are two arguments on this. One argument is the Japanese were ready to surrender, and we didn't need to use those weapons, and we only used them to frighten the Soviet Union. That's one argument. The other argument is the Japanese, we had already begun to work our way toward the Japanese homeland. We had gone to Okinawa. The Okinawans they basically had been indoctrinated during their entire lives by the militaristic ethic of the militarists who had taken over Japan in the 1930s. And that indoctrination said, it is better to commit suicide than it is to allow yourself to be taken by an enemy. And more than that, don't just commit suicide. Kill as many of the enemy as you can. So there were people laying in caves looking as if they were wounded and asking for help, and American soldiers would get near them and they'd have grenades in their hands and they'd blow themselves up and the Americans too. There were all kinds of wily ways of suckering the Americans in and then killing them. So not only did the Americans lose a humongous number of lives in trying to take Okinawa, but eventually all of the 35,000 Japanese citizens of Okinawa committed suicide in one way or another, many of them committing suicide in ways that killed as many Americans as was humanly possible. And the Americans looked on this as a preview of what would happen on the Japanese homeland. And they calculated that if the same thing happened on the Japanese homeland that had happened on Okinawa, the Americans, between the American lives lost and the Japanese lives lost, 2 million people would lose their lives. So you have a choice if you are Harry Truman. Do you invade the Japanese mainland and keep your nuclear weapons from use and lose 2 million lives, or do you use your nuclear weapons and lose 160,000 lives, thus, relatively speaking, saving 1.8 million lives? Which choice do you take? Which is the moral choice?
well, I think there are some other choices you could have made, though.
Oh, tell me. I'm curious. I never thought of one.
Well, I mean, I think there would have been ways you could have demonstrated the power of the weapon you had, and not taken that many lives. I mean, I know that there is a little bit of a shock and awe tactic going on there, but I think that if it had even been conveyed the power of the weapon we had, I don't think that they would have dared take a stand against us. Basically, I remember I was watching a documentary about a director that I enjoy particularly, Akira Kurosawa, and he was talking about the day that the emperor called for Japan to surrender, and everyone in Japan basically expected the emperor to demand that Japan, all of the Japanese commit suicide, but instead he declared that they were surrendering to America, and the Japanese went along with their emperor because many of them at that point still viewed him as a divine being. So really,
Right.
it was just a matter of convincing that one man to back down, and I think that we could have conveyed the power of our weapon without choosing civilian targets and without
Well,
bringing
you
about that
might be
many
right.
lives
You
lost.
might, but remember, we tried shock and awe in Iraq, and it didn't work because we were trying to avoid civilian casualties. So we made a great big noise all over the place.
Well,
But
I mean, the Iraqis had an understanding about our military capabilities, and this was something that at the time must have just seemed like the hand of God coming down to smite you. This was something that was probably inconceivable to the Japanese at the time it was happening. So
but it's the big question is really this: if a question is framed as starkly as that, and if it's a difference between losing 160,000 lives and losing 2 million lives, if that arithmetic is accurate, what's the moral thing to do? Because the leaders of the world presumably are up against this kind of question on many occasions. Um, and
well, I don't think you can just reduce it to the numbers either, because I think that it was the beginning of the time where we really felt as though we could inflict massive casualties on our enemies without even risking casualties on our own. And I don't know
right,
that that's a healthy attitude or a healthy occurrence in human history. But I guess if I was ultimately faced with that decision, I probably would choose to sacrifice the least amount of lives because,
but
you know,
it's a demonstration. I mean, just as I like the little mini essay that you gave. It's a demonstration of the fact that these things are relative. I mean, let's go back for a second. Can I tell you a chimpanzee story?
sure.
The morality is not unique to human beings, and we have taken it from animal ancestors, and then we've built on it considerably. And of course, we have the ability to think with words, and animals don't. But here's where you find the roots of morality. First, there's the empathy experiments of 1959 in which you took a rat and you trained it to press a lever in order to get some food. And then you hooked the lever up not just to the food, but to a little electrical switch that turned on the electricity under the feet of another rat next door. And what do you think the rat that's got control is going to do? Is he going to hit the button, get food, and not care that the rat next door is screaming and jumping? Or is he going to sacrifice his own good and forget about the food in order to deny himself the food in order to keep the other rat from having pain? Remember,
Uh,
these are just rats, for God's sakes.
I don't know, but given the other rat experiment you've talked about, it seems like that he would just allow the other rat to suffer. But I'm guessing that's not the
No,
case.
that's not what happened. As soon as the rat realized that the other rat, or as soon as the rat saw that his neighbor was jumping around in pain and that it was directly related to his pushing the button, he forgot about the food. He was ready to deny himself the food in order to keep the other rat from having pain. Now, that's a very anthropomorphic um, interpretation
Right.
of what was happening. But if you read Frans de Waal on the subject, you read about all of the controls that were established and all of the side experiments that were done to figure out what was motivating the rat. And it genuinely does seem, from actually 40 years of research since then, as if that rat was demonstrating some kind of empathy and some kind of altruism. Then
Right.
you get to chimpanzee behavior, and we're back to Frans de Waal again and his book Chimpanzee Politics. And in Chimpanzee Politics, de Waal, by watching a group of chimps in a semi-natural setting, in a huge zoo, the Arnhem Zoo in Holland, where they had just a big expanse for their chimpanzees to act as if they were in the wild. Um, he watched, and he had his grad students watching minute by minute, hour by hour, and day by day as Chimpanzee Politics unrolled. And a young male chimpanzee that was developing crazy ambitions and wanted to rule the troop would first go about the job for about 2 years of doing politics. He would kiss babies. He would make friends with mothers. He would develop a constituency, and he would make friends with the most powerful males he could possibly find until he built himself a little alliance. And then he would start to challenge the dominant male. The challenges would only last about 2 minutes each, but they would be real high stress competitions with both males, the existing dominant male and the challenger, going up against each other, standing absolutely straight, their faces stern, focused, concentrated, like I could kill you if I wanted to, and the hairs on their shoulders erect, so they looked magnificent. They looked like kings. They looked huge and regal. And then, of course, they'd go behind a rock when the confrontation was over, a 2 minute confrontation, and they'd make sure nobody was looking, and then all kinds of bizarre insecurities would go flying across their faces. And in one case, the monkey would have this nervous, or the chimp would have this nervous grin on his face, and if anybody saw it, it was the end. That was the end of his act of being magnificent. And he'd try to pull his upper lip down with his fingers because he was so nervous he couldn't control his face. At any rate, after a bunch, possibly a year's worth of these 2 minute confrontations, eventually it would become obvious that the old male is losing it and that the young male has been doing a better job of politicking among the wives and children, and the old male is losing his support, and he can't continue this anymore because going through these face-to-face confrontations is really a matter of testing not just your own indomitability, your own confidence and security. It's a matter of testing the security that's based on knowing you have the backing of the mob, the crowd. So the new male takes over. Now, guess what happens? This is where chimpanzee justice, where the leader, being those who lift the poor and the oppressed, comes into play. Because the chimp who has taken over in part because he has a very strong male alliance behind him.
Yeah.
Well, that means being loyal to his allies. Well, when one of his allies, who's usually a big boy, a very tough guy, goes up against another chimp lower on the social ladder and kicks the shit out of him, the male has two choices. The guy on top, the new leader, has two choices. He can either step in and stop his ally from enjoying himself, kicking somebody smaller around, or he can side with his ally in kicking the somebody smaller around and let it take place. Which do you think is the wisest decision if you want to stay chopped chimp?
I don't know. Depends on if he ran on the Democrat or Republican platform.
Well, it seems the chimps run on the Democratic platform. Because if he lets his allies get away with terrorizing the other animals in the troop, the other monkeys, the other chimpanzees in the troop, if he lets them get away with injustice, he is fucked. He will lose his position very, very rapidly. On the other hand, if he suddenly reverses gears and does not just support his allies, but does not allow them to pick on the little guys, if instead he is the champion of the little guys, if he lifts the poor and the oppressed, all of a sudden he's the epitome of justice and he holds on to his constituency. He holds on to his popular following. So even in chimpanzees, there is the beginning of what we would call justice, the legal system, intermediation, the whole thing. Because intermediation of disputes is at the heart of the legal system, and apparently the chimpanzee instinctual code says, take the side of the little guy, now that you're on top. That is your job. So morality is not unique to us human beings.
I'm almost embarrassed by how irrelevant this question actually is, but
Nothing's irrelevant, TJ.
Well, yeah, I know, but,
Even sports is not irrelevant.
Well, let's not go too far, but, I keep thinking about cogito ergo sum. And
yes.
all the criticisms there are out there. And I have a criticism. I don't, I know I've read a lot of the other people's criticisms, but my real problem is not the is not the think or even the therefore I am. And I know that criticisms can be made of those parts, but my problem is with I. And
Yes,
I don't know if it makes sense to me to say I think. Um,
right.
to me, it seems like it's the other way around. Like the thinking creates the I, or at least the
Well, that's a
conception
good
of
one.
I.
That's a really neat concept.
And
That's
it,
a very, very
you
neat
know,
concept.
I don't think I creates thinking. So
Think I, therefore I am.
I don't know. I don't know how you would phrase it, but modern neuroscience, from what I've read as a absolute layman who has the shoddiest understanding of modern neuroscience possible, it seems to bear that out. And I guess that this really has nothing to do with anything in the world, but I was kind of curious about your thoughts about the relationship between thinking and existing.
Well, okay, here's a couple of perspectives, if I can remember them as we go along. Um, I wrote a long essay on this, and which I don't think has been published anywhere, but I can't remember what's been published and what hasn't. And it's basically about the fact that Descartes, it's 1635 roughly, and Descartes has spent some time in the army, and he's gone and seen a bunch of Europe, and he comes from a wealthy dad. His dad had an office with the French administration. In those days, an office with the French administration means you work out of your home office, but at least you get paid and you have high status. And he is into philosophy, and he starts thinking, okay, look, what is the one thing that is left if we pare away absolutely everything in life? Are we left with anything that gives us any sense on which we can base all the rest of our thinking? Is there anything fundamental there? So I'm not expressing his question very well, but but he decides to pare away absolutely everything in his life to see what there is that is really fundamental, the one thing that you cannot object to by any stretch of the imagination. He wants to see if there is such a thing. So he goes off to a foreign city where they don't even speak his language, Amsterdam in Holland, where they speak Dutch. He speaks French. He gets himself an apartment. My impression is that it's on the second floor of a brownstone-like building. Um, and he tries to isolate himself from humanity in every way possible. And he does. He isolates himself in a study, and he thinks, and he thinks, and he thinks until he feels he has just ripped away everything from his life. And what is he left with? Thinking. He's
Right.
left with thinking. That's the one thing that he cannot deny that he is doing, and comes up with "I think, therefore I am," and then turns it into a proof for the existence of God through God knows what kind of mental torture and gymnastics. Um,
Yeah, that's a tough
but
one. But
yeah, but God was obligatory in those days for a philosopher, proving the existence of God. So we'll just stick with cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Now, what's the problem with his feeling that he has pared away everything and is only left with thinking? Because we know he's thinking. I mean, yeah, that's one thing that's very apparent to him. Um,
well, I'm gonna give you my take before you give yours because
okay.
I don't want to have to follow your probably brilliant thing with my
Ah,
stupid shoddy thing, but
yours is terrific. So go ahead.
but I would imagine that the problem there is that he's still receiving so much input from his surroundings. You know, to me, like thinking is not really something that just magically generates itself in a vacuum. I mean, there's really no way to test whether or not it would, I guess, but
Well, you've got it. I mean, that's
it
basically it.
seems like
He is
I mean, he's perceiving the world around him, and his ideas are still being generated by sights, sounds, flavors, whatever else.
even more than that. There is the residue of hundreds of thousands of people resonating in his brain. How? He has taken a carriage or a horse to get to Amsterdam. A carriage and a horse. Who invented the damn carriage? Who invented the wheel? Who invented the springs that support the carriage? Who tamed the first horses? Who built the city? The city is the result of the labors of tens of thousands of human beings. There are humans in the street beneath him. He looks out the window periodically and he sees the hats of the people beneath him. Now, granted, he's a philosopher. So he looks at those hats, and all he's able to see is the broad hat, and he's not able to see the person below. So he imagines, what if the person below doesn't exist? All I've got is the evidence of the hat. Nonetheless, he has the evidence of the hat. He's sitting there, and he's kneading a ball of wax. and the fire is going, and the fire is keeping him warm, and he has eaten today. Well, there are people out in the fields. First of all, there were tens of thousands of generations of human beings who came up with the idea of planting seeds and growing food in a regular manner, in an organized manner. There are the people who invented roads to get the food to him. He goes to the bathroom periodically. He says, like most philosophers, he has this remarkable blankness about ever going to the bathroom. It doesn't show up in his philosophizing. Well, that's as much an apparent thing as his thinking is. Plus, I've told you this before, there's a cleaning woman. And guess what he's doing with the cleaning woman?
Getting it on.
Yes, he makes her pregnant. Now, how in the world does he do that if all he's doing is thinking? Plus, he's thinking in words. Cogito, ergo, sum. That's a language. It's a tool. How many generations or thousands of generations did it take to develop the tool of language, to develop the sentence structure that gives him three words that mean something when you put them together, and to develop the roots of those specific words which came from Indo-European, made it all the way across from Persia to Greece, and to Rome via the conquests of approximately 1200 BC, and have had a long history before they ever came to his tongue, a very long history indeed. So he is carrying the compacted residue of at least tens of thousands of the creative acts of his fellow human beings, little human beings like you and me. And every time he opens his mouth, he is not speaking for one man. He is speaking for the 100 million cells, 100 trillion, cells that make up his being. He is speaking for all of that chromosomal information that's in him, but he can't see that. He won't be able to see that till the days of modern biology. What he can see is the long history of even those three words, cogito, ergo, sum, which in a sense sum up the entire experience of the Roman Empire. So he's ignoring the fact that he is a multitude. No matter what he does, no matter what he thinks, no matter how much he cuts himself off, he is a multitude, not just an individual. And ironically, he is both a multitude and an individual, terribly lonely in his own mind all at once.
Yeah, and he didn't even seem to do that good of a job of cutting himself off. I mean, the guys who meditate in caves at least make a valiant effort. He didn't even
Well, you've
that
got a
far.
good point. That's an extremely good point. However, he has a point, which is that when you close your eyes and try to rule out absolutely everything else, you're left with the fact that you're thinking. But hey, as long as you're thinking in language, sorry, you're carrying a multitude around in your mind all the time. You are a multitude all of the
Well,
time.
you're not just thinking; you're also perceiving, and I think there's a slight distinction, maybe not a
Right,
huge.
and then there's the question of identity. What is an I? What in the world is an identity? And I think you've nailed it. We don't even have to go into what an identity is for a vase or what an identity is for a stone,
Yeah.
and the more basic stuff, because you nailed it when you said that maybe it's the thought process that's creating the sense of an I, not the I creating the process of thought.
Well, from what I've read, from people like Antonio Damasio and stuff like that, it seems like that is the case. But anyway, I
Okay.
want to
One
I want to
more.
switch gears because
Okay.
I don't want
But
to.
I want to throw a bloomasm at you.
Okay, go ahead.
You've heard this one
Do
before,
it.
but it applies here. Opposites are joined at the hip.
Yeah, I
And
agree with
usually
that.
things that look opposite are part of the same process. So thinking and I are part of the same thing. Without the I, you probably don't have the thinking, and without the thinking, you don't have the I.
I want to talk about music. Because
Ah,
you were a major figure in the music business, if you want to call it the music business. I don't know what you prefer calling industry, whatever. In the 1980s,
right.
and some of the 70s, I guess too.
Yep.
Now
1976 to 1988.
I like music from the 80s and I like music from the 70s. So in my perception, you were part of something that was really alive and vibrant and interesting. However, I detest music today. I really.
I love it.
Okay.
I love
Let me
it.
finish. Let me finish.
Okay, go
Because
ahead.
I already know that you do, and
Yeah.
I really hate the mainstream, and I really hate the underground, and I feel like like this rotten fucking music is a symbol of a rotting within the human soul, and
Well,
everything seems to be escapism to me. Nothing seems to confront anything. Now, even the pop acts of the '80s to me had something genuine in them. There was like an honesty there. I don't see that now, and I know that you do. So I want to
Well,
ask you, where is it? That's my first question: is
right.
where is it? And number two, why can't I find it?
You can't find. Okay, let me give you the really, really appallingly egotistical interpretation of this. Okay, when I came into the music industry in 1976, it was a sleazeball industry. In order to get clients, the biggest PR firm in the music industry used to take company presidents, give them so much cocaine and alcohol, if that's what they preferred, it was ridiculous, give them luscious young women, and then sign a contract while they were still drunk and then pay absolutely no attention to the people that they were supposed to be publicizing. I loathed that. I despised it. And ever since ever since I was 13 years old, I had realized that despite starting in microbiology, despite starting in theoretical physics and all that stuff, that my real quest was to find the gods inside of us. And the gods inside of us come ripping, roaring, and snorting out of you when you are making music. You don't know where the fuck your lyrics come from. You don't know where the hell your chord progressions came from. You don't, and when you're on stage, if it's a really good night, something jerks you around and manipulates you as if you were a marionette. Something from deep inside yourself and deep inside the audience, and something deep inside the audience comes pouring through you as if you're an empty pipe, hits that something inside of you that just explodes and comes funneling back through you to the audience, and it's a reverberatory loop. It just keeps growing. And you come off stage and you have no idea what happened to you, because that wasn't you dancing on stage. That was something dancing you. Well, my job was to find the something inside you that danced you. My job was to find the something inside you that wrote your lyrics. My job was to find what I set out to find when I was 13 years old, the gods inside you. And my job was to say, TJ, you don't just owe your audience your songs, you owe your audience your life. And I've told you, I didn't understand what I meant. All I knew was that it was true. It took me 15 years of going back to science to realize that what I was talking about is the fact that if you are singing songs that hit people in the heart and come from your heart, I want you to put your life out on the line, because kids are going to grow on the trellis of your life. That's the iconic thing we were talking about at the beginning of the evening. Kids are going to put your poster on their wall. You are going to be the trellis that will shape a significant part of their lives. So you better damn well give them your heart, your soul, your you, who you are, the essence of who you are. Now, that was a process. It was a lengthy process. It was an extremely intense process. It was a process that said, fuck you to drugs, fuck you to giving worker company presidents girls. It focused on the fact that if you walked into my office and you wanted to be my client, I told you point blank, we are not in the business of exchanging money. We are not in the business of selling pieces of plastic. We are not in the business of selling CDs. We are in the business of the exchange of human souls. And unless you understand that, you don't know what you are doing in this industry. And I did something I used to call secular shamanism. My job was to find the gods inside of you and introduce them to you, because you have a conscious self. You have a self that knows how to go through all the rituals. You have a self that knows how to say, when somebody else says, how are you? You know how to say, fine, thank you very much. And that is the self that you are aware of from day to day. But when that other self inside you, that self of the deepest passion, writes a lyric, and you sit there at 4 in the afternoon and you look at what was a blank sheet of paper only 2 hours ago and wonder, where the hell did that come from? Or when you're danced around on stage and it takes an hour for your normal personality to come back once you walk off stage, well, that other self inside of you, I wanted to introduce to the conscious self inside of you. So not only would you be aware of the deeper self inside you, the gods inside of you, but so you would let those gods rip, roar, and speak, and so you would be true to them, because they would change year after year after year. They would keep a common core. They were based on your imprinting points, for God's sakes, but they would grow and mature, and every year would be a year of confusion. I mean, what is the human experience all about? Every couple of years, we enter a new phase of life. Sometimes every minute of every day we feel as if we're entering a new phase of life. And we enter that new phase of life with confusion, and we have no words very often for the experiences we're going through. And what does a pop star or a rock star do? A rock star, in some way, even if only with body language, articulates the strangeness of that experience we're going through and gives us a sense that we are not alone. We're not just lunatics. We're not just going crazy, that there are a whole bunch of us going through this experience. We're not alone. We are a movement. That's what a rock star does. There is nobody in that industry doing secular shamanism today. There is no one in that industry who understands that the business is not one of hits and it is not one of melodies, even though those are very important. It is a business of human soul. And it is not even a business, it's a soul exchange. It's a two-way proposition. You know that when you're in a concert. If you're in the audience, you know it. If you are on stage, you know it. And because there's nobody to set up the perceptual framework within which to understand what music is all about, we have people who are making music that is absolutely superb and who put their entire lives into making it. But no one understands that their lives are as important a part of what they offer their audience as their music is. And no one is doing what I was doing back then, and I wish to hell I could franchise it somehow because we need it. You know, I listen to all these bands. Thank God for Pandora. With Pandora, there is no mainstream anymore. With Pandora, there's your stream. With Pandora, there's a stream that adapts itself to you. And if you're like me and you're sort of out of all social groups, but just have a finger in them from time to time, well, nobody's telling you what you should listen to and what you shouldn't. Sure, you know that you're not supposed to listen to Britney Spears, although I love some of her stuff. But hey, you know, you don't have anybody putting social pressure on you. You can listen to your own damned music, your own mainstream. But not knowing who these people are, that deprives us of something. Not knowing the passions that move these people to dedicate their entire lives to take the huge risk of being a musician. Do you know how many musicians who try to be musicians make it in any way whatsoever? 1 out of 10,000 at the most. So these are people who are gambling with their lives in order to get through to you, in order to be able to take what they're all about and share it with you, and yet they are not allowed to share one of the most important parts, and that's who the hell they are and why the hell they are that way. So that's my analysis. I think there's tons of great music out there. I mean, the songs that Pandora plays to me yesterday was Above the Rhine or something like that Pandora was playing. I can't think of the artist, but there are so many. I know that some of them are not part of any mainstream because when you're a mainstream musician, at least Pandora has a bio for you. Well, a lot of the stuff that Pandora plays me doesn't even have a bio. Now, it's still very competitive to get onto Pandora. I talk to a lot of musicians who aren't on Pandora. So it's very competitive to get onto Pandora. But the fact is, there's tons of good music out there. There just aren't good, well, there are good marketing people, but a marketing person thinks he's dealing in an inanimate product. He thinks he's dealing in a product. This is not a product, TJ. This is the very heart, soul, and bleeding essence of who and what we are. Now, that may be an over-romanticization of what music is. I don't know. Because when I was doing it, that's the way I experienced it.